What's the scariest story you've ever heard? Viewers Edition.
Ooh, time for some scary stories. Story 1. So, this story was told at a 5th grade camp to me and a bunch of other 5th graders. At a 5th grade camp, there was a boy named Franklin. He was a kind boy, if a bit shy and awkward. He didn't like being at the camp, mainly due to 3 boys named Adam, Chris, and Brian. These 3 would frequently harass him. The only thing that kept Franklin from feeling down the whole time was his grandmother Fran, who was the head cafeteria lady at the camp. One day, Franklin decides to go and do the horseback riding activity, but unfortunately, Adam, Chris, and Brian decide to mess with him again. They had done horseback riding before and recognized the trail, so they head down the trail and hid in the bushes. Their plan was to wait for Franklin to get close and then jump out and scare him. So they wait for a bit, and Franklin comes riding down the trail. Once he gets close, the 3 jump out and yell. However, this didn't scare Franklin. Instead, it scared the horse. The horse bolts down the trail. No matter how hard he tries, Franklin can't get it to stop. Suddenly, the horse jumps off a steep drop, and they both fall down. The 3 boys ran over to see if Franklin was okay, but all they could see was the horse lying on the ground, not moving. They bolt back to the camp and tell the counselors what happened. The counselors ran to the site and managed to move the horse. Unfortunately, Franklin was underneath the horse and was already dead. The counselors were heartbroken. They knew that they had to tell his grandmother, so the head counselor goes to the cafeteria and finds Fran chopping vegetables. He tells her that something has happened, and she gets a little tense but keeps chopping the vegetables. He then tells her that one of the campers had died. She starts freaking out a little and saying it couldn't be Franklin. All the while, she starts chopping the vegetables faster and faster. The counselor then grabs her and hugs her. She starts crying and runs out of the building. Everyone leaves her be as they think that she needs to be alone. The next morning, the counselor tells the boys in his cabin to get up and ready. They all do, except Brian. The counselor calls out his name, but Brian doesn't respond. He then walks over to Brian and shakes him a little, but he still doesn't respond. So the counselor opens the sleeping bag, only to find blood everywhere inside and Brian's body with stab marks. He gets the other boys out of the cabin and gets to the other counselors to come. They all see the horrific scene and almost begin panicking. They all question how Brian was killed since the counselor who discovered it was in the same cabin that night, and his bed was next to the door. One of the cafeteria workers comes down and tells them that Fran was nowhere to be found, and one of the knives was missing. It was immediately made clear what happened. Fran stole one of the knives and somehow snuck into the cabin that night and killed Brian while everyone was asleep. All the staff began calling the police and parents, but the camp was hours away from town and they couldn't arrive until the following day. So that night, all the students were moved into 2 different cabins and the counselors kept watch. While on patrol, one of the counselors hears something, and when he turns towards the direction of the sound, he spots Fran running around the woods. He yells for the other counselors that he spotted Fran. Most of the counselors bolt into the woods after her. However, Fran has already snuck into the boys' cabin. She walks up to Adam. She opens his sleeping bag. She raises the knife in her hand. That's where the story ended. I had to make up a few things since I only heard the story once over 15 years ago, but this is how the story went down. I have no idea why a bunch of teachers, our teachers were our counselors, thought this was a good story to tell a bunch of 5th graders. I mean, probably because your teachers wanted to scare you, because it's fun to tell scary stories when you're camping. And you don't tell, when you tell camping stories about like, oh, it's us and our friends out in the woods. Here's a scary story of some friends out in the woods. So, yeah, definitely a little extreme to be like, hey, 5th graders, here's the story about 5th graders getting killed. But then again, I've helped teach 5th graders, and 5th graders can be kind of obnoxious jerks sometimes, at least some of them, so maybe some of those teachers just saw this as a way to get a little revenge by creeping them out.
Story 2. This one still gives me chills. So I had the magic mesh, the magnetic screen door that you could walk through on my doorway to my room.
I got it to attempt to keep my cats out, but they destroyed the bottom. Huge failure. So I ended up tying the bottoms in a knot to stop them from messing with it more. I kept the top half connected because the magnets would make a distinct sound when they connected. I kept it like that so I could hear when someone was in my room. One morning I had woken up and rolled over to face my doorway. I had my eyes open. I saw what looked exactly like my dad instantly turning away from me and walking out of my room, as if I caught him in the act and he fled. At that moment I was peed off because all I thought about was, why was he in my room while I'm sleeping? I went right back to sleep after that. A few hours later I woke up to my mom in the kitchen and asked her why the F dad was in my room. She had no idea what the F I was about because she said that he was still sleeping and wasn't in my room. I told her that he was and that he was wearing those gray shorts he sometimes wears around the house. She said that he wasn't, he was wearing the navy blue ones and he had been asleep all morning. That she had been awake for a while and he never left the room. I was confused because I know I saw him, but then I realized that he was in my room, which meant that he would have had to pass those magnets upon entry and exit. Those magnets never made a click, nor did the net itself move. There was no clearance for him to pass under it because, like I said, I left it that way to tell if someone was in my room if I was elsewhere in our tiny house. It was like he glitched through the net. I also didn't see his face when he turned to walk out. He turned away from me. And his reaction time to realizing that my eyes were open was too quick for someone sneaking around. Every characteristic of my dad was on him, down to the exact outline of the baldness of my dad's head. I told my mom right then and there what the F happened, and she said she wasn't surprised. She had seen my dad's doppelganger before. She had said that one day she came home from work. About an hour later, she heard the front door open and saw my dad walk in. She said hello to him, and he ignored her and continued walking towards the back of the house. A few minutes later, he walks by her again and leaves. She shrugged it off as he had his moodiness. About an hour or so later, my dad gets home and she asks him what the F happened earlier that made him ignore her. He said that he didn't know what the F she was talking about, that this is the first time he's been home all day. And the same morning that I saw my dad's doppelganger, my dad eventually woke up and walked into the kitchen wearing those navy blue shorts, by the way. I told him what happened, and my mom told him her experience, and my dad also said that he isn't surprised because he saw his own doppelganger years ago when he was a teenager. My dad is from a very small town in Georgia. His coaster home was surrounded by woods. He said one night he woke up and saw a figure walking towards his bunk bed that he shared with his brother. He said as it got closer, he thought it was his brother who looked just like my dad. My dad said that it wasn't his brother, that it was actually himself. He wore the same outfit that Dad currently owns in his closet and had the same hairstyle at the time that his brother did not. He said that his doppelganger didn't say anything to him. It just looked into his face for a few moments and turned around and walked out of the room. He saw it a second time when he was cleaning the blinds. Ever since then, he hasn't seen it again. The chills that went down my entire body was unreal that morning. To find out that my parents at different points in life have seen my dad's doppelganger is spine-chilling to me. I've always wondered if that meant something, like looking at your doppelganger could mean that you need to truly reflect and see yourself. But what my mom and I experienced, I haven't been able to figure out the why or how behind it.
Well, before your mother and father gave their accounts, I was pretty sure that you were just dreaming, because dreaming that you see something within your room, like as you're waking up, but you're not fully awake, is actually fairly common. Like your brain, like dream and reality cross. And so that part makes sense. But then your mom and your dad having the same encounters in different times, all that kind of stuff, that I don't know about. And that is pretty creepy.
Story 3. This is the story of how I told my dad his phone was ringing. So my sister had a school dance, and my mom went with her. Me and my dad stayed home. I had recently gotten into a YouTube series called Crypt Fairy Tales. They take classic fairy tales and put a special dark twist on them. So I was basically binging all night. I get up to leave my room to get a snack. Once I get into the living room, I find it to be dark and completely empty. I walk into the kitchen and turn the light on. I don't care if the whole place is lit, just that I have some light so that I can see. The kitchen is empty as well. I then think to myself, where the heck is Dad? Before I get my snack, I look to see if any of the bathroom doors are closed. Maybe he was in the bathroom. The bathroom doors were open and no one was inside. The lights were off as well. I then see if he's in his room, in my mom's room. He wasn't. The lights were off in that room as well. For some reason, I just think, oh, he probably decided to go with my sister to her school dance after all. Okay then, guess I have the whole house to myself. A little strange he didn't tell me before he left, though. And I walk back to the kitchen to get my snack. Once I'm in the kitchen and looking through the fridge, I suddenly hear a little girl laughing. It sounded like she was in the house and in the living room, the room closest to the kitchen. But then after listening to the laugh for a few seconds, I realized something. Wait a minute, that's my sister's laugh from when she was 5. My dad had set his ringtone as my sister's laugh a while back just because he thought it was cute and it made him happy to hear her laughing. Normal parent stuff. I walked into the living room and find my dad's phone. Someone was calling him. I thought, wait, if Dad had left, why would he leave his phone behind? It was then at that moment when I remembered that my dad likes to work with guitars and other stuff in the garage. I took his phone with me, opened the garage door, and there he was. I completely creeped myself out for no reason. We then had this short conversation. Me, hey Dad. Dad, yeah? Me, your phone is ringing. Hands over phone. Story 4. The green face one at the end was scary because I grew up in what I would call a haunted house. As I got older, stuff started to slack off and I could almost brush it off as an overactive imagination if it wasn't for this one story. My mom successfully potty trained me by about 3.5 years old, but even then I would always have her sit with me in the bathroom. I would pull my pants down and do my business, flush and wipe, and leave all on my own, so one day she asked me why I wanted her to be there with me. I told her that when she wasn't there, I always heard a baby crying from the bathroom closet where the water heater was. A bunch of other weird stuff happening in that house, but my mom and dad don't believe in such things, so I wasn't really surprised when they brushed it off. My mom and dad got divorced when I was 16, but we moved back to the same area when I was 19. For sentimental reasons, I decided to check out the old place. Turns out somebody had recently moved in maybe a couple months ago, and being an outgoing person and also secretly hoping to get a glimpse of the inside of the house, I just had to say hi. His name is AJ, and I ended up becoming pretty good friends with him. One day around Halloween, I was over at the house, and it was pretty late, so I started fooling around telling scary stories. All of them are true stories that had happened to me at that same house. He's a pretty skeptical and logical guy, so he's not buying any of them until I break out the baby story. I told him, yeah, and when I was little, I could never go to the bathroom alone because if no one was in there with me, I would always hear a... And then I absolutely freaked out when he said, please don't say you heard a baby crying. I told him yes, that's exactly how it was, and I asked him how he knew about the baby. My parents don't believe in ghosts, and they think anyone who talks about them is a Looney Tune, so they wouldn't have spread the story, and even if they had, we really don't have any mutual friends between us. He tells me his 5-year-old daughter, Adriana, has been having problems going to the bathroom by herself ever since they moved to this house. She was completely potty trained and doing just fine for at least a year at the old house, so she just assumes the move was stressing her out or whatever. But when he finally asked her, she told him that when she went to the bathroom alone, she heard a baby crying. When I confirmed it was a baby crying, he kind of thought he just suggested that answer into my head. Like maybe I could tell how panicked he was and just went with it, so he asked me where I always heard the baby, and I told him it was in the closet where the water heater was. Apparently that closet wasn't there anymore. They had done a lot of remodeling to the house and the water heater was moved into the hall, so I walked him back there and pointed to the corner of the room, and he absolutely lost his crap. That story went from one of the least creepy, almost forgotten memories of my childhood to the scariest thing that happened to me there, and all because it has happened to someone else too, and I can't just brush it off as my imagination anymore. I mean, I can and I do, but still, creepy. So much stuff happened in that house that if I told all the stories, it wouldn't seem fake. I want to look up the history of that place, but not bad enough to actually do it, if that makes sense.
It's a fun story, and it is creepy when children, report stuff, especially 2 different children over the course of, a 15 or whatever year difference. But I do have a theory. I have a theory that there was some wiring or some pipe running through there, where near abouts the old water heater that was moved, that was at a certain frequency. Fun fact, as you get older, you start to not be able to hear certain frequencies. I think typically higher ones. I don't know the science on this. People in the comments can absolutely correct me. But it's possible that those frequencies are just like, something like that, that to a little kid around that age who's able to hear that frequency might have thought it sounded a little bit like crying, and any adults in there couldn't hear that frequency. So, I don't know. That's my one theory, but what do you in the comments think?
Story 5. The scariest story I've ever heard is about the Whistler. I was sleeping over at a friend's house, and since I was having trouble sleeping, I thought to turn on a podcast, and the one I happened to find first was Scared to Death, where two people exchanged horror stories. I was sleeping in the finished basement, where I was in full view of several long windows, and I had already had issues with being watched. So the story begins. This woman moves into her new home, buying it from some Venezuelan couple who just returned from a vacation from there. Her and her old retired police dog start taking walks. Once she hears whistling, echoing in her head like it was the only sound ever, she starts to freak out a little bit. But if the retired police dog isn't bothered, she shouldn't be either. She keeps walking through her skin and is crawling with the feeling that something is wrong. The whistling becomes more and more distant, and soon she can barely hear it, like a fly buzzing somewhere in the room with her. She felt something across her face, like maybe she'd walked into a spider web as her dog started to bark. Soon the whistling stops, and she can't feel the spiderweb thing anymore. She returns home, freaked out, and nothing happens for the rest of the night. But the next night, when she saw her neighbor outside with a campfire and his girlfriend, but she doesn't really care. They aren't being so loud, so it doesn't matter. There was a shriek, and she looked over. The fire pit had fallen, and the girlfriend was on fire. Soon an ambulance had arrived, and the girlfriend would of course be sent to the hospital. The neighbor was freaked out, and he told her about it. There was a whispering that started very closely, then slowly distanced, like the guy who was whistling kept walking away from them. Soon his girlfriend shouted because she had a hand across her face, scratching her. Soon she decided to look up whatever the hell that thing was. It was a Venezuelan horror story, and it describes what she experienced, but it usually results in the person dying. I think it had been a while, and I can't remember. Unless there was a dog barking nearby. She couldn't afford to move again in the next few months, so she stayed, keeping her dog with her whenever she went outside. She partly believed that maybe this was happening because of something the old owners did, and that's why they were in such a hurry to sell the place. Soon she saved up enough and managed to sell the place and got the hell out of there. If I missed any details of the story and anyone is willing to fill them in, that'd be great, but for the most part, this was the story that freaked me out way too much. Story 6. This was a story I heard from an old railroad engineer that I'm friends with. One day they were doing a midnight goods train with 4 other people when their train got diverted onto another line due to the fog and some old rusty points. Once they realized what had happened, they stopped and radioed into the control what had happened, and since the passenger train was coming through soon and they were worried about switching the points back to their line after switching the passenger train, they decided it was best to stay there for the night. They were in an old rail yard with rusty trucks scattered about and large burn marks and destroyed rails in one of the sidings, with what looked to be the foundation of an old factory nearby. They decided to head to sleep, but he later woke up to the sounds of static coming from the radio and a loud, trumpet-like groan from outside the engines. Suddenly, the radio was filled with chatter. A lot of it was hard to figure out, but he did say it sounded something like, "Coal is too hot," and "Emergency, emergency, clear the area immediately." The burnt ground nearby seemed to almost glow as screams came from the radio, the loud groaning getting louder and louder, causing the engine's windows to vibrate. They soon turned on the lights to see something written on a nearby truck in some kinda ashy, bloody paint that they hadn't noticed earlier because of the fog that had cleared up by then. And it said, "Death comes for all. Run, run, run." They immediately threw the engines into reverse and shot back down the old line, screeching to a stop before the old points. The groaning had disappeared, and they still don't know what any of that was to this day.
Look, old abandoned rail yards are scary enough with, people there who are probably in very desperate situations and possibly on mind-altering substances. You don't need to make it scarier with friggin', ghost radio train, Lord knows what's happening. Good grief.
Story 7. I know it sounds stupid, and I know saying something from a Five Nights at Freddy's book freaked me out makes me sound childish, but it genuinely made my stomach turn. It is the third story from Tales from the Pineapple, Somnophobia, Clythrophobia. Basically, this guy is a technician who has clythrophobia due to an experience he had when he was 5. So basically, he gets dragged through these tubes by a robot who's designed to help people who are stuck. But the part that freaks me out is the description of the absolute horror this guy went through. Her, the robot's grip, breaks his fingers, then his forearms, then his upper arms. He just starts falling apart. His ribs get popped off and his legs are barely attached. When the robot is grabbing onto his upper arm, she accidentally gouges his eye out. He's hoping he will pass out because of the unimaginably gruesome pain, but he doesn't. Some employees he works with come back to work after leaving for the night and find him. He's stretched to at least twice his original height in the tubes and is completely mangled. All his bones had pierced through his skin when they had been broken, and his uniform was saturated with blood. The robot is holding his eyeball. The worst part? He was conscious as he saw the employees he considered his friends left him to die, all while the robot is continuing to drag him through the tubes, causing him to become even more mangled. His face is incapable of expression because it had been smashed so much. The employees eventually just leave. Even though they knew he was dying the worst death imaginable, they would rather that than getting in trouble for having him there alone. He would be a huge liability to Fazbear Entertainment. He was conscious the whole time and saw them leave. The story makes me sick for some reason, and I've heard of the most disturbing, gruesome murder cases and watched plenty of movies that include mutilation and dismemberment, and those don't scare me. This? I don't know what it is, but it is awful. I thought the second story in that book was gross, but this one just really got to me. That description doesn't go into nearly as much depth as the actual story, and I think that even if you don't like or enjoy Five Nights at Freddy's, horror and body horror fans would enjoy it.
You know, when you said that, I know it sounds stupid, and you mentioned Five Nights at Freddy's, I'll admit my eyes were kind of rolling back in my head a bit oh boy, come on. What you've described there, even without the detail, is like nails on the chalkboard of my soul. That sounds creepy. If I had to read a more detailed account of that happening and stuff, that does sound very genuinely disturbing, at least to me, and apparently you. So, I'm with you. That is,
Story 8. The story I heard from my grandma in Mexico scared me crapless. I've heard it in other places too, so I assume it's just an urban legend. There was once a lady who was a devout Christian. She and her husband would go every Sunday to church. After Sunday service, she would often cook for the congregation. Tamales, arroz, sopa, she would cook it all. But her most beloved dish that she would make was pozole. Everyone in the congregation agreed hers was the best in town. She was loved by the community so much, so it was a terrible tragedy when she died. The entire congregation mourned her death for a week. Then at Sunday service, the lady's husband cooked in honor of his dead wife. He made pozole. After he served everyone their bowls of pozole and everyone sat, he gave a mini speech about how his wife's devotion was to the church and to cooking. He then said, "Take this as her final offering to us all, and she will live on in us forever." He finished his speech and everyone began eating. Most people noted that it tasted different from his wife's pozole. Not bad, just different. Everyone was enjoying their bowls until a teenaged girl bit into a tough piece of meat. She couldn't bite all the way through her first time biting into it, so she tried again, and again she couldn't bite through it. So she pulled it out and inspected the meat. She screamed loud and threw what she now recognized as a finger on the table. Everyone at the table looked in shock and started screaming as well. Some threw up, some came at the man asking what was going on. All he did was repeat what he said earlier. Take this as her final offering to all of us, and she will live in us forever. It was later confirmed that he had dismembered her body and used her as the main ingredient in his pozole. Her blood was mixed with the broth, her body was chopped into pieces, and cooked. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.